Welcome to the Down Dog Athletics Podcast, a competitor's guide to mental health and mastery. My name is Paul Klingen, and I'm your host. Down Dog Athletics' mission is to make yoga and mental health more accessible to athletes. As an athlete myself at the Division I level, I didn't realize how much I was struggling with mental health until I started practicing yoga and meditation. As athletes, we're programmed to go harder, go faster, and be stronger. We're very rarely given permission to slow down, but it's that slowing down and that stillness that you find more awareness. When you find more awareness, you're able to smooth out inefficiencies, and as you smooth out those inefficiencies, you're able to go faster. I invite you to join me on this journey as I interview some of the top experts in mental health and mental performance to give you the tools and tricks necessary to manage your mental health and improve your own mental performance. What's up, everyone? Thank you so much for tuning in. I am so excited for today's guest, and I'm going to get to it really quickly, but I just got a quick story, and I'm training for this marathon that I was never even going to do until maybe like 2 weeks ago when one of my buddies was like, dude, are you going to do a marathon? I was like, no, absolutely not. And just like a virus, just got kind of planted in my head. And I was like, should I do it? Should I not? And that's when I was like, damn, I got to do it. So training for a marathon now. But the reason I wanted to bring up this story is I was talking to a client, and one of the things that I've been doing on this marathon training is what I've just come up with a name of dark side trampolines. And I want to share it with you real quick. Essentially, it's the concept of a lot of people will hit rock bottom, and that's what causes them to spring forward and do something that they need to do to get out of that deep darkness or that pain. And I don't recommend anyone to ever go to rock bottom to make changes. But what this dark side trampoline that I'm calling is essentially like an artificial rock bottom that springboards you forward a little bit more. And how I'll use it is I'll think back to an emotion that like gets me angry or gets me wanting to run faster, or I'll think of a scenario that doesn't even exist and I'll play out in my head like, oh man, if I don't hit a certain time or if I don't keep training like I need to, then this group of people are going to be disappointed in me. And it's not even the case. But what I do is I create these little micro dark side, like rock bottom moments that so many of us try to numb and avoid. But when we don't allow ourselves to feel those negative emotions, then we do nothing to get out of that situation. So there's a time to definitely say like it's okay and you don't need to be angry. You don't need to be sad. But sometimes those negative emotions can be used to good. And so that's what this dark side trampoline is that I'm using. I talked about it with a client where a lot of times we'll have someone say something and it'll be hurtful, and for a moment we'll be motivated, and then 2 days later we lose that motivation. But what I'm saying is go back to that moment, re-feel that emotion, and let that emotion catapult you. And that's why I call it a dark side trampoline. It's this negative emotion that normally would be used for bad, but instead you use it as this like lighter, and then boing, you just launch yourself forward and use that as motivation. And you can use that, every once in a while, or you can use it in like small little microdoses as you need for motivation until you can build the habits and build that why and build that North Star that's going to pull you forward in more of an inspirational way. And now I don't want to take any more time from today's guest because I was so excited to have Dr. Patel on. It's not every day that you get a neurosurgeon to come on your podcast about mental health, and this was something that was kind of a dream for me. We talk about so many different things that I've been really interested in getting really an expert's opinion on, and the guy went to school for 16 years. He's been doing this for a really long time. He is 100% an expert. He is a doctor and is a neurosurgeon, which is crazy to think. But he, we talk about how mental health affects the brain at a chemical level. How does alcohol affect the brain? How concussions affect the brain? Different tactics that he uses from a mental visualization standpoint to go into surgery and visualize negative things happening so that he has the muscle memory to go and be successful. We talk about how drugs work for the brain and when they work and when they don't. And it's so interesting to hear him talk, and he does a really good job of bringing it down to a level to which general population would understand. And sometimes you'll run into that with experts where they're talking so up high and you're just like, yeah, sure, I know what the carburetor is, and I agree that the car needs to be refueled and reoiled. But it's like when they explain it in such a down-to-earth way, it's so nice because then you actually have actionable steps and can go and articulate it maybe to a friend. So really excited to have Dr. Patel on. Without further ado, here we go. Akshal, what's up, man? Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul. I'm a neurosurgeon. I work at Swedish Medical Center. My specialty is stroke. And the vast majority of what I do is brain and cranial surgery, but I also do spine surgery. But the majority of what I do is brain related, and specifically stroke cases, brain hemorrhages, things like that, and occasionally tumors.
Wow. So with coronavirus happening right now, how has your day-to-day changed? We were talking a little bit off camera, but I know elective surgeries aren't happening, but is there anything that coronavirus is affecting that is kind of like bleeding into your work?
Well, it has affected my work to a certain extent, like you said, in terms of elective cases. What is interesting, though, is that there's still a lot of emergencies that happen, and so I still do emergent and urgent cases and surgeries. But what has affected it is the willingness of certain patients to come to the hospital. For example, this weekend, I had a couple of stroke patients and 2 big operations on the weekend, and both patients were delaying their care because they didn't want to come to the hospital. So I think that there is some reticence or hesitation for patients to come to the hospital because of coronavirus. But I think if you do have a problem, or if there is some concern, that you should not be concerned about seeking medical attention. People are still working and still at a high standard with all the best equipment and best people. But yeah, I've noticed that people have tried to avoid the hospital even if they need hospital help. So,
Wow.
which is interesting.
You see that in a lot of other professions too, where someone's like, "Oh, my ankle hurts. I'm not going to go to a physical therapist," or "Oh, I need to see
Right.
a therapist, but I'm fine." Like these problems aren't big, but I can't imagine having a stroke and being like, "I'm good." Like I don't.
No, it's surprisingly there are patients just like, I'd rather not come in. I want to see how it goes, and it never ends right. So you have to kind of be careful with that situation.
Yeah, especially when we're talking about the brain.
Yeah.
Fill the listeners in on just your background, and I know to get to where you are, there's an insane amount of education that goes on, but just kind of talk about that journey. What made you want to get into this profession to start with?
So it's kind of interesting. I didn't think that I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. I didn't expect to be here. It takes about 16 years after high school to get to this point in terms of full training. I started off wanting to going to college and wanting to be a writer. When I first went to college in my university in Boston, there wasn't any housing left by the time I signed up for it, other than the pre-med housing floor. And so I signed up for the pre-med housing floor just because there was nothing else there. And I was doing all these literature courses. I was doing an arts, basically a Bachelor of Arts degree at the time. I still have a Bachelor of Arts degree. And I was doing poetry, writing fiction, I needed some science classes to build up for requirements for my Bachelor of Arts degree. And I did some of the classes with my pre-med folks, and I did well in those. And that was around the time we had that first economic recession, around September 11th. And so I was seeing some of my other colleagues who were doing the same profession as I was, or the same college degree, and they weren't getting jobs, things like that. So I thought, let me just try to do as many science classes as possible. And I did really well in some of the pre-med requirements. So I applied, I did the MCATs, did pretty well, went to medical school, and was doing pretty well in medical school, but I never thought I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. I wanted to be an OB when I was in medical school. And like most things, you hang out with the wrong people and you end up in the wrong places. So I was hanging out with a neurosurgeon at the time, and I thought what he was doing was really cool, especially when it comes to brain and brain science and brain surgery. And so I basically fell in love with that, and that's basically led me to becoming a neurosurgeon.
Wow.
It took 7 years of residency.
So life advice: hang around with the wrong people, aka
yeah, or mentors. Find the wrong mentors, or find the people that you didn't expect to be in, or a position you didn't expect to be in. So
yeah, totally. So I have a few friends who are going through their residency at UW, and one of the things I've heard is that there's a shortage of the people just with the degree of experience that you have, right? 16 years of education takes a long time to get there. Is that true in the field of neurosurgery, or because I imagine there's a ton of patients that strokes, right? The things that you talked about, yet there's only so many of you.
Right. There is going to be a shortage. I anticipate there will be a shortage of neurosurgeons by the next probably 5-10 years, because it is a field that takes a lot of time, and it's a field that requires a lot of stamina. And because of just those two things and the way that medicine is evolving, I think that we're going to see a lot less neurosurgeons being trained, which is going to lead to a shortage in the future.
So
who knows what?
Oh, sorry. I'll use Syria to say who knows, and then I had a question.
Well, no, who knows how that will translate in the future, how that changes how we work. If I will become more busy, or the few that will be left be much busier, and will that mean that we should perhaps shorten the training requirements, change the way we train surgeons, make it more attractive for young surgeons to become neurosurgeons? I don't know how that's going to play out.
Yeah, you mentioned how medicine has evolved. How is medicine evolving? And there's a few questions I'd be interested in your perspective. One on like drugs for things like anxiety or depression, but then also we're seeing the evolution with, for example, MDMA psychoassisted therapy, and like is that something that might be happening? So how has medicine evolved just in the time that you've been in your field?
I think there's well, two things. I think there's a less of a reliance on the regular pharmacy. So on the regular pharmaceutical, medications in terms of the treatment of disease, getting away from narcotic medications as well through your education, or less of a reliance of medications that you may become dependent on for treatment. But also from a surgical standpoint, a focus on robotics. And so a lot more surgery, I think, will be done robotically or even remotely in the future.
Yeah, the robotics one is interesting just because I know how little sleep surgeons can get potentially.
Yeah.
The joke always get scheduled for a surgery in the morning when you've had rest as opposed to the end of the day. What is kind of the status on robotics taking over, or at least being introduced?
So I think that we're already seeing primetime spine surgery being done robotically. It improves the accuracy and the safety for a patient, and also would reduce the amount of pain potentially a patient will be after surgery for robotic spine surgery. For robotic brain surgery, we're on the early horizon of that, and I think that's going to revolutionize the way we deal with stroke in the future. I wouldn't be surprised 10 years from now if most strokes are being done robotically from a distance, from hundreds of miles away. For example, last year in India, they did the first robotic cardiac catheterization surgery, and that was from 100 miles away. So a surgeon was operating 100 miles away from his patient, and I think that that's going to basically be the future for how we do robotic surgeries here. So distance is going to be the issue. And so the robot is one thing, whatever, that's just the piece of equipment, but what's going to change is telemedicine. So how we can do surgery from a distance.
Curious with that, is there still going to be a role for surgeons, obviously in using the equipment 100 miles away, but also in the assessment? Like at what degree can a robot or AI look at, maybe it's the actual like inside of the brain, and be able to say, oh yeah, this is what needs to happen?
That's going to continue to get better and better. So already now we have certain modes of surgery we can do with augmented reality. And so using augmented reality to help surgeons dissect through layers of the brain and find out where they're going, mapping exactly where you're going in the brain. I think that's just going to be an extension of what we do robotically, helping us guide our way through the maps within the mind, and trying to figure out where we need to go, how we need to treat a patient, how we need to treat the disease. From a robotic standpoint, also just the interaction, we're seeing more Zoom stuff, with the whole COVID issue. I think this is going to get the technology platform for interacting with patients through video conferencing and through robotics is just going to get more and more elaborate, I think.
Do you think there will be a situation where it's almost robotics experts become the one doing surgeries, or will there always still be a need for someone who has a detailed understanding of the brain and your background in 16 years of medicine?
I think you're going to need someone who knows a lot about how the robot works, but also some of the experience. I think you can't replace the 1,000 hours, the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours of experience that you need to do to be an expert, or to be at the level of expertise where you're confident that you can get yourself out of most problems, deal with most challenging issues and obstacles as you encounter them, how to adapt and overcome those things. And so that, I don't think you take the human out of that quite yet.
Yeah, which is good for you. I'm sure you'll have some degree of education with the robotics. I'm curious with the amount of focus that you've got to have, right? We talked about the rest that you would need. How do you manage stress where maybe you get in a situation where you're like, oh shit, I did the wrong thing or I'm in the wrong area, how do you make sure that you don't get too sympathetic and start making mistakes that start to compound?
Yeah, well, I think that's very key. I had a mentor here at Swedish. His name is David Hanscom, and I think he has his own podcast, but he's always training us almost like sports people at the top of their game, like golfers at the top of their game, like Tiger Woods. He's about to tee off, and there's a cameraman who suddenly takes a click or a shutter click, and he's trying to be the best and the most present he can to be at the same portion. So at that moment, so that he can provide the best shot. If you're going to try to translate that or crosswalk that with surgery, at the time of surgery, you want to be as present as possible. To be as present as possible requires a lot of practice, but it also, just like any other muscle that requires practice, you have to be able to focus appropriately on the steps that need to happen and the anticipation for problems in the future. When problems do arise, you're right. There is that worry that you may panic and you may get stressed. And certainly there are stresses that suddenly happen. But I think the way that I kind of have adapted to that is to not to panic. And I don't know how to say this, but the reason why that training is so long is that training kind of helps you adapt to certain things like sleep deprivation, understanding how to deal with stress and panic, and understanding how to mentally alter the way that you do certain things so your heart rate doesn't rise, so you don't suddenly make the wrong mistakes. Me personally, what I've been able to do is just use my breathing, to kind of stop me from freaking out and to try to step back from the situation, certainly, if a problem does arise. Staying calm, unfortunately, does take practice. Even when it comes to tremor, when bad things happen, your tremor gets worse. Staying calm requires a knowledge of the problem at hand, a knowledge of the anatomy, and basically a little bit of courage to kind of figure out how to solve the problem very quickly.
Yeah, you mentioned the understanding of the anatomy, and I imagine no one knows the brain more than you, or at least very few people. What's actually happening at the brain level when we get an external stimulus that is a stressor that would then send us into sympathetic response, or how do we use breathing to take a little bit more of an executive function over those initial thoughts?
So I think that the first thing that rises, the one thing that kind of like goes crazy is the adrenaline, and so the ways to counteract that adrenaline response is to kind of put yourself in a position where you kind of understand what's happening. So knowledge is power. So understanding that that's actually happening to your body sends a kind of a feedback loop to yourself. And that feedback loop to yourself and understanding what's actually happening to yourself actually helps reduce the anxiety, reduce that adrenaline response, and counteract it with other types of neurotransmitters that will keep yourself in a better position. And so you'll be surprised that mental feedback loop that you can actually train yourself. And some people use breathing, some people use other mental kind of tricks, as it were, that they've discovered, that they've subconsciously even developed, where they understand what's happening. And once you can kind of understand what's happening, it's almost as if you have created a new pathway to kind of counteract that response.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting. I wish there was a way to study it in young surgeons, because you will probably notice as young surgeons continue to train that feedback loop that they mentally can control gets better and better and better and better and better.
So that almost leads me to another question. And I like to think of neural pathways and like the thought loops that we have as physical loops, right? Someone has a specific form on a basketball shot. To your understanding, do they work the same way in the brain? One's just controlling a thought, one's controlling the actual motor movement?
Right. So there's muscle memory that you can build up during times of panic. And so one little example, for example, and this is just what I do, when I'm doing surgery and I'm about to get to a very tricky portion of the surgery, and I'll take an aneurysm, for example. So aneurysms are like blisters in a blood vessel, and we have to, during surgery, sometimes put a clip across the neck of the aneurysm. Well, when you're doing surgery, sometimes that aneurysm or that blister can suddenly bleed and explode. And during those times, you can just panic because there's just blood everywhere and you can't see anything. Before that happens, you want to test whether or not you can have the muscle memory to do the right thing in case that happens. So sometimes you go through the steps of what problems might arise before that problem arises. And so if that problem ever does arise, you have the muscle memory to do exactly what you need to do, even if it's blind. And so you go through the steps mentally before surgery. So I'm not sure if you've seen surgery, but sometimes they're like this with their, but before they even touch the scalpel, they're thinking through every step of the operation mentally and playing a mental game or rehearsing it mentally before they even touch the patient. And even during the steps of an operation, they're rehearsing the procedures in case that something bad happens. You've rehearsed it well enough that it becomes like that 3-point shot. You know, you've rehearsed it, done it so many times that even under the greatest of stresses, you know exactly what to do, or your muscles know what exactly to do, and they take over.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question.
No, and that's super fascinating. I remember watching a Blue Angels documentary. I believe it was a documentary, but essentially all of the pilots did the exact same thing where they watched themselves do the run. They on like a TV, but then they also would do the entire run in their minds, and they would all like kind of in the same way, like look and know exactly what's going to happen. And I find that so interesting because it's almost like when a train jumps the tracks, and then it's whether or not you've grooved that track well enough to get back onto it, like almost subconsciously, right?
Right. There's something already there for your mind to kind of sit on, or there's a framework to work with. And so that's basically what most people try to perfect during their career, trying to make sure that they have those things so there's no surprises.
Yeah, I love that you've already shared like how that parallels with like a Tiger Woods, or I would picture like a Navy SEAL, right? They're sleep deprived. They're under an intense amount of stress if they have to make a millimeter point like shot, otherwise someone else dies. And it's crazy how many different professions have that as like that high pressure situation where it's something as simple as not simple, but mental rehearsing and breathing is so powerful. And it's something that I think at a general population level, we could really benefit from simply by, we're in a presentation, we get a email from our boss, or we're in traffic, and those are much less pressure situations, but it all still works kind of the same way, where it's like, okay, I'm aware that I'm stressed, so now I can bring myself back down. But that awareness sounds like is like almost the biggest piece.
Yeah, the awareness is the biggest piece, and then whatever mechanism you use. I mean, I just use breathing, but there are many mechanisms that will help depending on the situation. Taking yourself out of the situation, for example, taking a 30,000-foot view of what's going on, trying to, first not necessarily doing surgery, but for other fields, closing your eyes, and I think you mentioned. A long time ago to me, certain types of, some people do yoga and try to kind of use that in terms of meditation and trying to figure out how to get themselves out of those stressful situations. You can't do that, obviously, you can't do that suddenly during surgery, but there are ways to kind of use the same techniques or similar techniques to basically find awareness and find a new position in that awareness. So you're not trying to deny the fact that something bad is happening or deny the fact that you're in a stressful situation, but you're trying to adapt to that new level, as it were, in the safest way possible for your brain. So it's not a shock to the system.
Yeah, 100%. So question on that, are there specific techniques, whether it is meditation or breathing, where we're actually able to impact the actual tissue of the brain? I've read studies that people who are chronically stressed, it might overstimulate certain parts of the brain, or people that meditate are able to actually increase the gray matter of the prefrontal cortex. Is that something that you've seen in your experience?
I've seen it, but not from an imaging standpoint, or not from I've just seen it through experience rather than actually seeing it in the brain tissue through, either functional imaging through an MRI scanner, or, seeing in my patients. I don't think you'll ever see those situations arise, and to capture them would be kind of a high level thing that you would have to be in a study for, essentially. I do know that the brain is always, it's surprising, the brain is always kind of on, even though you may be off, although you may seem that it's off. There's no such thing as a turned off brain. The brain is always active. And so understanding that is always running and not thinking that parts of the brain shut off or take over is very important to understand. From that standpoint, you basically have to find a way to control which parts of the brain are active and which parts of the brain you can make less active. And I think that how aroused you are and how kind of anxious you are about a situation really makes a difference in how much the neurotransmitters in your brain are kind of activating parts of the brain that you necessarily don't think are going to be helpful in the situation you are. So you have to take it for what you will. The brain is still a lot of soup as much as it is wiring. And so one important thing that is key is to understand how the wiring is. People are hardwired for a certain thing, but you're not permanently hardwired in that situation. And neurotransmitters can help, modify. If you can somehow learn how to mentally understand that's what's going on, modifying the way that you feel can definitely affect how the neurotransmitters work on the situation. For example, when you're aroused, we talked about adrenaline or epinephrine. We haven't talked about serotonin yet, but serotonin in times when you're trying to be more relaxed, you can pivot from one situation to another, but it takes a bit of practice, I think.
Is that what people refer to as neuroplasticity when you're talking about being able to shift or being able to make those changes?
Neuroplasticity a little bit more complicated. That's when the brain has endured some form of damage, and if you're young enough, and I would say even up into the late 30s, if you're young enough, your brain has the ability still to rewire itself and grow new pathways or develop new pathways that have been to bypass the ones that have been damaged. Neurons themselves don't actually completely recapitulate like they were before, but you can find a way to use the neurons that already exist to take over the functions of the ones that were damaged. And so that's neuroplasticity in a nutshell. It can happen. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort to do that. The old adage is still true. If you don't use it, you lose it. So when I have patients who've had some form of brain damage, I tell them, if you want to take advantage of neuroplasticity, you have to use your brain. Sitting on your couch watching Netflix all day is not going to do that. So I force them to do things that will train their brain, memory games, testing out the recognition of faces, reading a lot, using their imagination, getting out and talking to people, using their speech, interacting with the world. That all helps neuroplasticity.
Got it. So when someone has maybe trauma to the brain, whether it's actual like physical trauma or there's emotional trauma, is that the same kind of rewiring that would be happening? I guess maybe a better way of positioning it is those neurons need to go a certain way, but when there's trauma to the brain, now they are rerouted. And so you were saying through reading or speaking with people or different brain games, you're able to create new routes for those neurons to go?
With emotion, it's a lot more complicated because with every emotion, there's a memory attached to it. So this is getting a little bit probably more information than you want, but each memory, all our memories are embedded in our brain in such a fascinating way. It takes a lifetime of research to understand exactly how memories develop and how we kind of use them, but they're tied to emotions implicitly. So every time we think of an emotion, whether it's love or hate, it's tied to a memory. And those memories are embedded in certain circuits within our brain. They're not as defined as the other circuits, like let's say for moving your hand or being able to walk, but they are embedded into the circuitry of our brain. And there's no actual one spot that they could be. There's not necessarily just one spot where we say, oh, that's the memory center. It's embedded in many different parts of the brain, and those are all connected. The other part of memory that's fascinating is that's one of the few places we can actually time travel. You can travel back in time, space and time, through our memories. You can go back and see how our memories have affected and have changed us. So when you talk about emotion, let's say you've had emotional trauma, one of the things that psychotherapists, psychoanalysts, and anyone in the neuroscience field has tried to adapt someone's try to heal someone's emotional trauma is to move back to that memory, which and change it, or somehow understand how that memory was formed. Understand, let's say, you had a traumatic falling out with someone, like a loved one, going back to the time when that happened, going back to where you were when that happened, understanding the memories around it, the associations around it, and basically working through those and understanding through those, you can adapt and overcome through certain forms of emotional trauma that way. And just to not go into another topic, but PTSD is a huge issue, and especially even in the medical field, the people who are dealing with COVID on the front line right now. I'm sure you've heard some certain headlines where nurses and doctors who are on the front line are getting their version of PTSD from dealing with these patients and having to decide which patients can get therapy and which ones unfortunately can't, and having to decide life and death decisions is a form of PTSD. Repetitive PTSD can be just like what we talked about, a permanent settling of the wiring in the brain with emotions attaching to memories. And just like any other structural component of the brain, that can be so ingrained and embedded that chronic PTSD can lead to behavioral changes. And that has been a fascinating topic even through neurosurgery in terms of how to help people who have that chronic PTSD situations and how to how to help people overcome it. So
yeah, one of the most fascinating books I've ever read was Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps Score, and it talked about trauma really throughout the entire book and different types of it. And I think a lot of times, and I used to do this as well, but we think of PTSD as only something Vietnam War veterans would run into, or someone who maybe survived 9/11. But trauma can be micro, it can be macro, it can be all sorts.
Right.
And so these nurses that you're talking about, like they're having these repeated bouts. And I again, like coming back to the body for analogies, but someone who is stronger might be able to withstand trauma, whereas someone who might have maybe weaker bones or weaker muscles wouldn't be able to withstand a force. And is that kind of what's happening at the brain level? And before you answer that, I kind of want to also ask, how much of it is genetic and what you're born with, and how much of it is what you experience throughout childhood and how you cope with it as an adult?
Well, it's really hard to put on a focus on the genetic component on it because I don't think anyone studied it from a genetic standpoint. I wish I knew enough about the genetic components of what made people more susceptible to certain types of trauma. I know that certain other diseases, just like bipolar, can be transferred through genetic components, but I'm not sure how well the susceptibility or the resilience to someone's brain to certain forms of trauma, how it develops through genetics. I do know, however, that you can train yourself to become more resilient so that the repetitive traumas don't cause as much of a problem in the future. And that's kind of a mental toughness, thing, which can be learned. There's no such thing that mental toughness cannot be learned. It definitely cannot. It definitely can be learned. It can become a talent, and that talent you can use to help you in any future endeavor. So that's a total trainable thing. And you spoke about Navy SEALs earlier. I mean, their basic, their BUDS training is part of that mental toughness issue, and so they're being trained not to actually lift up a log or be half submerged underwater, or those are all useful things, but what that is doing is mentally training people. What residency is doing for doctors is mentally training them to withstand certain issues. And I do think that for certain fields that's overlooked, and so micro traumas can be a huge issue, and if it's overlooked, it can cause a bigger issue and a chronic issue, and it can become to the point where it really causes people not to recover, and that's when it becomes a very sad issue for patients.
I almost think, because you talked about with BUDS training, they're lifting logs, they're doing a bunch of physical things, but they don't really need to lift logs. They need the mental toughness. And my background in sports, I think of all the different times where I didn't need to actually run lines. It was a mental toughness thing and being able to tell myself I can do something that I can't do. It's interesting that you say like doctors could almost benefit from that. Like I'm picturing doctors doing sprints and be like, this has nothing to do with your profession. We're teaching you to overcome stressful situations. Coming
No,
back.
I wish more doctors played golf just for that reason.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
you don't tell doctors to. I mean, you could try to force a doctor to run lines, but or to swim laps in a pool. But if you just told doctors, like, mental toughness comes from the practice of being able to swing a club and not get aggravated, and being in the moment, or even skiing, or being good at a sport, like you had mentioned, being at the top of your game. It does help, whatever that happens to be.
Yeah, that's so cool. I'm glad that you said that. Coming back to when people have, like, is it possible for someone to maybe go through residency, just like someone can go through buds, and they don't actually have the capacity neurologically to handle that stressful environment?
I think so, and you've probably heard of the Doctor Death podcast, and the guy who in Texas basically somehow fell through the cracks of the education system in neurosurgery, and was completely a pathologic surgeon. And I think, unfortunately, there are people who do fall through the cracks in any field, but this one was a glaring one where someone could not deal with the stresses or the requirements put on them, either responsibility or the skill required to do certain fields. In this particular case, neurosurgery, which led to a very horrible set of circumstances. Really unacceptable in a certain way. And I hope that most of the training programs in the United States kind of look at that very closely and kind of understand how this person could have made it through. Because usually, especially in neurosurgery, there is a high attrition rate. So people do drop out in this field, and very few make it after the 16 years of training. So, as I mentioned, very few people make it to this position, or to any position in medicine where they're dealing with patients on a constant basis. And there's always tests during these phases of learning. I just think that some people make it through and they're not ready, and you have horrible consequences, like this guy, Dr. Death in Texas, who was maiming and killing patients, and it's awful.
Yeah. To that point, you talked earlier about how reliant we are on medicine and pharmaceuticals and drugs. And I've read that there's times when it's a chemical imbalance in the brain from a mental health standpoint and drugs can help. But then we've talked a lot about the brain and maybe how drugs might not be what the body or the brain needs. How do you approach that topic of chemicals, or like people say someone's depressed, it's a chemical imbalance. Like, how do you approach that topic, and what's your take on it being a chemical imbalance versus it being maybe like an example of PTSD?
I think that some people unfortunately are born with there was never any PTSD involved, and they were born with or they develop over time some imbalance in the neurotransmitters, and that's not their fault. It's just that maybe their cells are not releasing enough neurotransmitters. Maybe they're not receiving the right chemicals through diet. Maybe they're not doing the correct things, or they have a genetic issue with just the brain itself, and that's just the way the structure is. And so it's not their fault, but they're not producing the right levels, the right quantities of neurotransmitter, and that leads to mental health. And that's no one's fault. There was no trauma that induced it. That's just the way that they were wired, essentially. There's that portion of people, and there's a portion of people, like we mentioned, that have had chronic trauma, whether it's physical or mental or emotional, and that can develop into a worsening state of affairs. But to get back to your question, it's when I deal with it on a day-to-day basis, I try to understand what their situation is, where they're coming from. In my particular field, pain is a big issue. And specifically pain when it leads to after or before surgery, and how to fix that. And it can be many components to it, emotionally, physiologically, psychologically. And so when I deal with pain, I have to make sure that I'm not dealing with true sources of pain and true solutions with pain, long-term solutions, because my biggest thing is narcotics are not the right way to go for the vast majority of these patients. And they have to somehow get in control of their pain, but in a safe way. And I understand that there are going to be situations where you're never going to be pain-free. And that requires mental involvement. That requires an understanding and awareness of the pain. It requires a way, different types of behavioral changes that require you to adapt to the pain, and a reduction in the reliance of the narcotic medications that you can get addicted to.
Yeah. A lot of times with narcotics too, you'll see people will mix it with alcohol, and that's kind of something else I wanted to talk to you about, is like what effect alcohol has on the brain. And you'll randomly see studies on the internet, I'm sure are paid for by Budweiser, where it's like 1 drink a day can have you live longer, where I've seen like research that says it's not the actual alcohol, it's the social environments you put yourself in and the lack of stress that you put yourself in. And so maybe there's some validity to that, but just from like a pure physiological standpoint, like what is alcohol actually doing to the brain, and how damaging can it be?
Well, like alcohol in small quantities is not doing anything too damage to the brain. Your brain is able to adapt to it pretty well. It's people who drink very, very, very heavily who, and we're talking, I know this sounds really stupid, but even if it means a couple of glasses of wine a night, it's considered, in my medical field, it's considered a lot, so even if you're drinking every night, that's considered a lot of alcohol. And so at least the way that we were trained, that's basically a couple of glasses of wine a night, or a 6-pack of beer a night is too much alcohol. And over time, that can cause problems with the parts of the brain that control memory and the development of new memory. And so the biggest thing that this will damage is those portions of the brain that control and create new memory. And so people who are chronic alcoholics can get into situations, syndromes, where their short-term memory and to a lesser extent the long-term memory is completely shot. And so when that is shot, you'd be surprised if you cannot remember anything. It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. It's almost like that movie Memento. If you can't remember the next couple of hours what you did, you can imagine you can't really live a good quality of life.
Yeah, 100%. Is that almost like where someone has had a bunch of alcohol and maybe they've blacked out a ton and then they are like absent-minded? Is that an example of short-term memory? Or is that
if you have chronic blackouts, yes.
Yeah.
If you're abusing alcohol to the point where you're blacking out consistently, and that could be every weekend or every couple of days, that level of alcohol is so chronically damaged the brain that you will even affect your ability to, I guess, learning, because the memory is very attached to very intimately attached to learning. And so that can affect kids going through college. It can affect athletes, as they're getting better at what they're trying to do, whether it's being a better sportsman or a better, at the kind of skill they want to adapt in a game, that can all be affected with alcohol.
I'm curious, and this could be an entire podcast in and of itself, but you mentioned college kids, right?
Yeah.
Where you'd see the most binge drinking,
right,
on like a campus. In maybe like a paragraph, how detrimental is that to their development, knowing that maybe their brain isn't fully developed, or knowing that you mentioned that people can rewire themselves up to age 30, but if they have a 6-year bender, like how damaging is that?
It's very bad. It's very damaging. I think that, I'm not trying to be too paternal here and telling college kids they shouldn't have fun, but chronic alcoholism and blacking out, having alcohol to the point where you're blacking out, or having alcohol to the point where you're forgetting, or drinking, chronically for long periods of time, will cause enough of a problem long term that it's hard to really escape. Forget about the addiction portion of it. There's the whole, other aspect of it, which is kind of an addiction issue, and wanting to feel better because of the alcohol. But just from a educational standpoint, in terms of their ability to get better grades through college, will be completely dependent on that, how bad they are affected by that alcohol.
Are there diseases that people develop in their 40s, 50s, 60s that you could almost, not one-to-one correlate, but correlate pretty well to where it's like 10 years of excessive drinking led to dementia or led to this at age 60? Like, is that something that we can pinpoint, or is it just more like lifestyle habits as well with like exercise?
I think dementia is more common in the people who are chronic alcoholics when they're younger. So dementia is the biggest thing. Other than other body things, so outside of the brain, the rest of your body is not going to be too happy with chronic alcoholism. There's a huge impact on the liver, for example, and everyone knows that. But other body functions can really be affected by chronic alcohol abuse. The brain being my specialty, being the biggest thing, you'll see a high rate of dementia in people who are chronic alcoholics.
Wow. We've talked about athletes a lot, and another thing that you run into with athletes and the brain is concussions. And I know you've got a vast knowledge on that. Why is it that concussions are so hard to diagnose? Why is it so hard for people to get back to like the recovery time is 1 week or it's a year, and there's no like model or system to it? It varies so much.
Luckily in the last couple of years, Swedish specifically, at least where I work, we've come up with concussion protocols so that it's unified or kind of basically standardized throughout the whole system. 10 years ago, when people talked about concussion, there was no standardization. The science was not even present, as it were, and people weren't studying it. One of the reasons people weren't studying it is because a kid would get concussed, for example, in their minor league game, and they would feel fine. And their coaches, not having the right education at their fingertips, would put the person back to play right away. We know now that if there's any suspicion of concussion, there's a whole protocol that people have to follow for athletes, young kids especially, and I've had huge arguments with parents with this. I mean, I had a meltdown situation with a parent who had their kid playing football, and I'm sure you've seen those little kids who play football. The helmet is bigger than their shoulders, It's kind of, but football was a religion to this family. They had, the mother had 3 kids, 3 boys. They're all going to play football. They're all going to play football through college, and she was really mad that I said that, football, American football, like we know it now, in 20 years might not exist, because, we're getting more and more data with concussion, and it does not look promising for football, for example, with the science being there. And I don't know which parent would have let their kid have that amount of trauma repetitively over a long career, once they know the science of it, and the science of it becoming more apparent every day. So I think that the 2 things that have happened recently is, standardization and understanding the science of concussions, better helmets, and the University of Washington has a huge lab trying to create better helmets, especially the ones that are Seahawks, where Russell Wilson is wearing an experimental helmet right now, actually, and once we understand those issues, we'll have a better understanding of how concussions and repetitive concussions do impact, brain health.
Wow. So, question on concussions with like maybe a college athlete. I had the father of the Helsinki Hope Foundation, where he was a quarterback at Washington State, took his own life at I think 21 years old. And he had the brain of someone who is 60 or 70. I can't remember what that is. So what's actually happening to the brain when you have repeated concussions and that trauma to the brain?
So concussion is what's happening to the brain when we say concussion is that the brain is getting bruised. So the brain is getting bruised. And if you imagine getting a bruise on your thigh, if I keep damaging you, like if you go to Charlie horse, if someone punched your thigh, you would get a swelling there and a bruise there. Now imagine keep punching that piece of the thigh meat, and you realize that slowly that muscle is going to break down because you keep punching it. Similar with the brain, a concussion is like a bruise in the brain, and the bruise can happen at different areas of the brain. The brain, everyone has to realize, is in a fixed box, the skull, and depending on how the brain is rattled inside the skull, that will matter which part of the brain is getting bruised, quote unquote. And so different parts of the brain can get bruised based on the type of concussion and the location of concussion. Now, repetitive bruising causes damage to the brain where it has to where the neurons get damaged and they don't survive, they just die. And then the brain, their tissue parts of the brain, there's other cells in the brain that try to support the neurons, but those can also die. And what gets replaced? There's a fancy word for it, but in layman's terms, scar tissue kind of develops. The brain has its own version of scar tissue that develops. All in all, the amount of neurons, that part of the brain that contains the tissue that controls thought, memory, the way that we are, who we are, starts to shrink. And that leads to an inability to make appropriate decisions, affects the psychology, affects emotional behavior, emotional liability, and anger issues. If it affects neurotransmitter release, it affects a bunch of things that kind of makes it really complex to diagnose. If you just had one or two concussions, but also our ability to just be who we are. And some of these people can't be who they were after multiple concussions. We see that in kids who get multiple concussions going through high school, their grades drop. They go from A grade students to B or C grade students, and they don't even realize what happened. Their ability to concentrate goes down. The ability to take in new information goes down. That's happening in adults. Just because we're not in school and not being tested every day doesn't mean that our brains are not still having the same kind of deleterious effects.
Yeah. And so it's almost like reading as an adult is a way to continue to keep that going. You talked earlier about if you don't use it, you lose it. So when we're just sitting and binge watching Netflix and we're all trapped in a coronavirus, it's like the worst thing for our brains.
Right.
I was talking about this with someone else too, where when someone's in prison and they behave poorly, they get put in solitary confinement, which does a number on someone's brain. At least that's what the movie says. And you lose that face-to-face interaction that you talked about. And then now we're inside. We're losing interaction. We're watching Netflix. We're not exercising. It's like, in a way, it's something that I don't think it'll be bad or chronic, but not good for the brains.
No.
Collectively. Akshal, I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking so much knowledge. And this was actually something I was looking forward to for a really long time because this is a mental health podcast, and having an expert on the brain is so cool for me. I like to end with 3 personality questions that are not related to the brain at all, but it will give us an insight onto how you think. So you just finished your hardest workout ever, right? Barry's Boot Camp used to teach you there. What is the one meal that you want to have, like favorite food?
After Barry's Boot Camp?
Yeah.
I love the shakes. I love the Barry's Boot Camp shakes. Yeah.
Which one? Which flavor?
I like to get the muscle up and replace the pineapple with strawberries. So.
Oh, I love that. All right, cool. Favorite song?
Ooh, there's so many. Favorite song. I actually have people always ask me this, do I listen to music during brain surgery? And I do. And my favorite Pandora station is Midnight City Radio.
That's awesome.
So all that music that comes through Midnight City Radio, that's the kind of stuff I listen to.
That's so funny. It's almost like when movies have a soundtrack to like the film that's like your surgery soundtrack. That's so funny. All right. Speaking of movies, all-time favorite movie. It's Sunday night, movie night. What is that one all-time favorite movie?
I'm a sci-fi buff. I love Aliens, the second one.
Okay, cool. I love that.
Because it's James Cameron at his best. I've even read the screenplay. I don't think you can come across a better, situation. I love sci-fi. I'm a sci-fi geek, but that's one of my favorite movies of all time.
Cool. I love that. Well, thanks for sharing those fun little 3 facts after all the science. So, Akshal, again, tk you so much for taking the time. And I'll see you again soon after all this ends.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Before I let you go, just want to say thank you so much for listening to today's podcast. If you got something out of it and enjoyed it, please be sure to leave a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. Helps me grow the podcast so I can continue to have awesome guests like Dr. Patel on. And if you really love the theme of the podcast, be sure to subscribe and continue to listen to more in the future. Other than that, stay safe, stay sane, stay healthy. Hope you guys all have a great rest of your week. And I'll catch you next time on the Down Dog Athletics Podcast.